welcome to the deep dive. You know we love to go deep on all sorts of topics, but for this one, you guys actually requested this one specifically.
That's right.
So we're taking a deep dive into 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 20 to 22.
It's a passage that I think really packs a punch. It uses this really powerful analogy to talk about Christian character and conduct.
Yeah, it's one of those passages where I feel like I've read it many times, but every time I come back to it, I feel like there's another layer to uncover.
Yeah.
Like peeling back an onion. Hopefully less tear-inducing, though.
That's a good way to put it. Paul, the author of this letter, was such a master of using metaphors that really resonate on a lot of different levels.
Okay, so to set the scene a little bit, we're in the world of the early church here. Right. So who was Paul writing to, and what was the situation?
So this is a letter from Paul to his younger protégé Timothy, who is leading the church in Ephesus. And, imagine you're a young pastor in a city like Ephesus, which was known for its wealth, this massive temple to Artemis. And, well, let's just say a very active social scene.
Sounds like Timothy had his work cut out for him.
Right.
I can see why Paul felt the need to offer some guidance.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where our passage comes in. It's like Paul is giving Timothy this pep talk.
Yeah.
Reminding him of the kind of leader he needs to be in the midst of all this pressure. But it's also advice that resonates just as strongly, I think, for all of us today, no matter what our Ephesus might be.
I like our own Ephesus.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear the passage itself. What exactly does Paul say?
Okay, so here's 2 Timothy 2.2022. In a large house, there are not only gold and silver bowls, but also those of wood and clay, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable. So if anyone cleanses himself from these things, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart, useful to the master, and prepared for every good work.
Okay, a house full of different vessels. Sounds straightforward enough, but I can already tell there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating is that Paul chose the image of a large house. In those days, a wealthy household would have had this huge array of vessels. Everything from ornate goblets that you would use for special occasions to plain clay pots for everyday use.
Oh, so this is something Timothy would have been very familiar with.
Exactly.
He could probably visualize this scene right in his mind's eye.
And that's part of the brilliance of Paul's writing, is that he's using these images that would have resonated deeply with his original audience and would have drawn them into the analogy.
Okay, so we've got this house full of all these different vessels, some fancy, some plain. How does Paul connect that to the people within the church?
Well, he's basically saying that the church, just like a household, is made up of people with, different gifts, strengths, and levels of maturity. Some, like Timothy, are like those valuable gold and silver vessels, dedicated to God's service.
Okay, so they're the ones who've been polished and refined and ready to be used for something special.
But then you have others who might be more like the wooden or the clay vessels. Perhaps they're still being shaped, or maybe they're being used for purposes that don't exactly bring honor to the master of the house.
So it's not a judgment call on someone's worth then.
Right.
But more about their current state of readiness and the purpose that they're serving.
Precisely. And that's, I think, where the idea of cleansing comes in.
Okay, this is where I always get a little tripped up. Is Paul talking about initial salvation here, or is it something more?
Yeah, that's a key question. In this context, cleansing isn't about becoming a Christian in the first place. It's talking about, I think, a deeper ongoing process of separating ourselves from anything that might hinder our relationship with God and dedicating ourselves more fully to his service.
It's like that process that they had in the Old Testament for constructing the tabernacle. All those specific rituals and instructions for ensuring purity.
That's a great connection. Because, the tabernacle was meant to be a dwelling place for God's presence. And everything had to be meticulously prepared and purified. It was a really powerful symbol, I think, of the kind of holiness and dedication that God desires.
So Paul's essentially saying that we as believers are being called to that same level of dedication and purity. Like we're being shaped and prepared to be dwelling places for God's Spirit.
Exactly. It's about aligning our lives more and more with God's will and allowing him to work in and through us.
This cleansing idea, it makes me think about all those things in our lives that can distract us or pull us away from God. And I feel like Paul addresses that pretty directly in the following verses where he talks about fleeing youthful passions.
Yeah.
Ah, yes. Youthful passion. Speaking from experience, though, sometimes those don't always disappear with youth.
You're telling me?
But what would those youthful passions have looked like for Timothy in his context? When we know Ephesus was known for its well, let's just say a city of many temptations.
Yeah, you can imagine the pressure Timothy must have felt to compromise or fit in with the surrounding culture. Perhaps there were temptations to kind of downplay certain aspects of the Christian faith that were considered unpopular or offensive.
So it was about more than just resisting personal vices then.
Right?
It was about standing firm in his faith even when it was difficult or costly.
Absolutely. And that's a challenge that I think resonates just as strongly for us today. We face so many pressures to conform, to compromise our values, to just kind of fit in with the world around us.
Okay, so we've got this picture of cleansing ourselves, of fleeing these youthful passions. What's the flip side of that? What does Paul say we should be pursuing instead?
Well, he says, pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart.
Righteousness. That's a word we hear a lot, but I feel like it often gets reduced to just following a bunch of rules.
Yeah, you're right. It's so much deeper than that. Paul isn't talking about outward behavior here. He's talking about an inward transformation that shapes our entire being. It's about becoming more and more like Christ in every aspect of our lives.
That makes me think of how the gospel writers, they always highlight both Jesus's actions and his heart. He wasn't just going through the motions. His actions flowed from a deep, abiding love for God and for people.
Exactly. True righteousness isn't just about doing the right things. It's about cultivating the right heart attitude, an attitude of humility, compassion, genuine love.
And notice how Paul doesn't say, pursue righteousness on your own. He says, pursue it along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart.
That's a crucial detail, I think. It's a reminder that we're not meant to do this alone. We need each other. We need a community of believers to encourage us, to challenge us, to help us stay on that path of righteousness.
It's like having a spiritual support system. Just like Timothy had Paul. We need people in our lives who can mentor us, guide us, and help us grow.
That makes me wonder, who are the Pauls in your life? Who are the people that you can turn to for guidance and encouragement in your spiritual journey?
Oh, that's a great question to ponder. I think for a lot of us, finding those mentors and building those relationships is a crucial part of this whole cleansing process that Paul's talking about. It's like, letting others help us polish the silver, so to speak.
I love that analogy. It's about letting others speak truth into our lives, helping us to see those blind spots in those areas where we need to grow.
So we've got these two seemingly opposite actions, fleeing from some things, pursuing others. But I'm starting to see how they're actually two sides of the same coin. It's about letting go of what hinders us so we can fully embrace what God has for us.
And that process of letting go and embracing that's really, I think, at the heart of what it means to be a vessel for honorable use. It's about surrendering to God's shaping, allowing him to refine us and prepare us for the good works that he has planned for us.
This is already giving me a lot to think about. But before we go too far down that road, let's take a step back and make sure we're clear on what Paul means by honorable use. What are those good works he mentions?
That's a great question to unpack because it gets to the heart of what it means to live out our faith in very practical ways.
Sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover. Can't wait to dive deeper.
It's interesting how this passage in Timothy kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier with the parable of the mustard seed.
Oh, I don't see the connection yet. Fill me in.
Well, in that parable, Jesus talks about, that surprising growth of the kingdom of God, how something small and seemingly insignificant can have this huge impact.
Right. It's like that tiny mustard seed that grows into this massive plant that provides shelter and shade for all these creatures.
And in this passage, in Timothy, Paul's focusing more on the individual believer's role within that growing kingdom. We're like those vessels in a house being shaped and prepared for God's use.
So it's like two sides of the same coin. We've got the big picture of the kingdom expanding, and then the individual stories of believers being transformed and equipped to play their part.
Exactly. And just like that mustard plant needs the right conditions to grow, good soil, sunlight, water, we need certain things to really flourish in our faith.
Things like fleeing those youthful passions, pursuing righteousness, surrounding ourselves with a supportive community.
All of those things are part of that cleansing process that Paul talks about. It's about creating the right environment for spiritual growth.
Okay. And that brings us back to that question of honorable use. What are those good works that Paul's talking about? Is he talking about like building churches, going on mission trips, things like that?
While those things can certainly be a part of it, I think Paul's view of good works is much broader. He sees it as encompassing every aspect of our lives.
So it's not just about what we do, but who we are at our core.
Precisely. It's about allowing our transformation to spill over into everything we do. our relationships, our interactions with the world around us.
Okay, I get that. But it also feels a little daunting. It's like every single moment has to be about serving God.
Mm.
How do we even live up to that?
That's where I think grace comes in. Remember, it's not about achieving some kind of spiritual perfection. It's about surrendering to God's shaping and trusting that He's working in and through us, even in our
That's
imperfections.
a good reminder.
Hmm.
It's not about striving in our own strength, but really relying on God's power at work within us.
And this idea of being prepared for every good work really challenges me to think about my own life. Am I making myself available to God? Am I willing to be used by Him in whatever way He sees fit?
Yeah, it's like we were saying before, we need to be both available and able. We need to have those skills and gifts,
Uh,
but then also be willing to step up and use them when the opportunity arises.
and those opportunities might not always look the way we expect. Sometimes good works might involve confronting injustice, speaking truth to power, challenging the status quo.
Right. Thinking back to Timothy, he was leading the church in a city that was steeped in paganism and immorality. I'm sure there were plenty of opportunities for him to really stand up for what he believed in, even when it was unpopular.
It's like that image of the gold and silver vessels being set apart for a special purpose. It implies that there might be times when we need to stand out, to be different, to refuse to conform to the patterns of this world.
So it's not always about blending in and being nice. Sometimes it's about being bold and courageous, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
And that takes discernment, knowing when to speak up and when to hold back, knowing when to challenge and when to comfort.
Which brings us back to that importance of having those Pauls in our lives.
Yeah.
Those mentors and guides who can help us navigate those really tricky situations.
Absolutely. We need people who can speak truth into our lives, who can offer wisdom and guidance, who can really help us discern God's will and walk in obedience.
We've been talking a lot about what it means to be a vessel for honorable use. But what about those dishonorable vessels Paul mentions? Are there some people who are just inherently bad or unusable in God's eyes?
That's a tough question. But I think it's important to remember that Paul's writing to Timothy, who is pastoring a real-life church full of messy, imperfect people.
So it's less about labeling individuals as good or bad,
Right.
and more about recognizing that everyone's at a different point in their spiritual journey.
Right. And even those who might seem like those wooden or clay vessels, the ones who are still being shaped or who might be caught up in ungodly behavior, they still have the potential to be transformed.
It's like that image of the potter molding the clay.
Mm.
Even if the clay is misshapen or cracked, the potter can still work with it, reshape it, and make something beautiful out of it.
Exactly. And that's where God's grace comes in. It's not about writing people off because they don't measure up to some standard of perfection. It's about offering them hope, extending grace, pointing them toward the one who can transform their lives.
It's a reminder that we should never underestimate the power of God's transforming grace. He can take even the most broken and seemingly unusable vessel and make it into something beautiful and purposeful.
And that's something we should remember about ourselves too. We all have those areas in our lives where we feel like those wooden or clay vessels, those places where we struggle, where we fall short, where we feel, far from honorable use.
It's like those cracks and imperfections of the clay.
Right.
We all have them.
But the good news is that God doesn't throw us away because of our flaws. He sees our potential, He knows what we're capable of, and He's willing to work with us to shape us, to transform us into vessels that can be used for His glory.
That's a really encouraging thought. It's a reminder that God's grace is sufficient for us even in our weakest moments.
And that's where the importance of community, I think, comes back into play. We need each other to encourage, to support, to challenge, to remind each other of God's grace and His power to transform.
It's like having a whole team of potters working together to shape and mold each other into vessels that are fit for the master's use.
Now, you mentioned earlier feeling a bit overwhelmed by the idea that every moment should be about serving God. I'm curious, how do you think this passage helps us navigate that tension between, living our everyday lives and being those vessels for honorable use?
That is a great question. I think it's helpful to remember that God doesn't expect us to be, spiritual robots constantly churning out good works.
Yeah.
He created us to experience joy, to have relationships, to enjoy the world that He's made.
That's a really important point. It's about finding that balance between our everyday lives and our spiritual calling.
Right. It's about allowing our faith to permeate every aspect of our lives, not compartmentalizing it into, a separate religious box.
And one thing that helps me is to remember that even the most mundane tasks, like, washing dishes or going to work, can be acts of worship when they're done with the right heart attitude.
So it's less about trying to cram in as many religious activities as possible, and more about approaching every moment with a heart that's surrendered to God.
Exactly. It's about allowing God's love and grace to flow through us in every interaction, in every task, and every encounter.
It's like those gold and silver vessels.
Yeah.
They weren't just, beautiful objects to be admired. They were meant to be used to be filled with something precious and valuable.
And we as believers are meant to be filled with the love and grace of God, allowing it to overflow into the world around us.
That's a powerful image. It's a reminder that our lives aren't just about us. They're about reflecting God's glory and being conduits of his love to those around us.
As we've been talking, I've been struck by how this passage kind of encourages us to think differently about success.
Oh, how so?
Well, the world often defines success, in terms of achievement, wealth, status, power. But this passage suggests a different metric.
Yeah, it's like, are we being useful to the master? Are we allowing God to shape and mold us into vessels that can be used for his purposes?
Exactly. It's about faithfulness, not fame. It's about service, not self-promotion. It's about making a difference in God's kingdom, not just building our own little empires.
That's a really radical shift in perspective. It's a reminder that true success isn't about what we accumulate or achieve in this life, but about how faithfully we steward the gifts and opportunities that God has given us.
And that brings us to, I think, an important question. How do we know what those gifts and opportunities are? How do we discern God's will for our lives?
That's a great question to explore because it gets to the heart of what it means to be a disciple, someone who's actively following Jesus and seeking to live out his teachings.
And as we dive into that, I think we'll see how those seemingly opposite actions that Paul talks about, fleeing youthful passions and pursuing righteousness, actually work together to guide us on that path of discipleship.
I'm ready for that deep dive. Let's explore those ideas further. Okay, so we've been talking about this idea of being vessels for honorable use, about all those good works that go beyond just outward actions. It's about who we are at our core. But how does that connect to the idea of discipleship, of actually following Jesus?
Well, that's, I think, where things get really interesting because, being a disciple isn't just about believing certain things about Jesus. It's about letting those beliefs radically reshape our lives.
It's like, okay, I believe that Jesus is who he said he was, but what does that look like in my day-to-day life? What am I supposed to do about it?
Yeah, and that's where the rubber meets the road, because discipleship is about action. It's about following Jesus, even when it's costly, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it goes against the grain of the culture.
It makes me think about what Jesus himself said. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Those are some pretty strong words.
They are.
Yeah.
And it reminds us, I think, that following Jesus isn't always a walk in the park. It often involves sacrifice, self-denial, even suffering.
Yeah, the source material mentions the example of John the Baptist. He was imprisoned and ultimately beheaded for speaking truth to power. That's a pretty stark reminder that following Jesus doesn't always lead to a life of, ease and comfort.
Absolutely. And throughout history, countless Christians have faced persecution, hardship, even death for their faith.
But even in the midst of all of that, there's this thread of joy and purpose that just shines through. It's like they found something worth suffering for, something that gave their lives meaning, even in the face of immense challenges.
That's the paradox, I think, of the Christian faith, isn't it? We find life by giving up our lives. We find strength through weakness, and we experience joy even in the midst of suffering.
And I think that gets to the heart of what Paul is talking about in this passage. This process of becoming a vessel for honorable use often involves going through the fire, being refined and purified. It's like that image of the potter molding the clay. Sometimes it takes pressure and heat to really shape that clay into something beautiful and durable.
And that refining process can be painful, no doubt, but it produces something valuable. It shapes us into the kind of people that God can use to bring hope and healing to a broken world.
So it's not just about our own personal growth then.
Right.
It's about becoming agents of transformation in the world around us. It's about letting our light shine so brightly that others can't help but notice.
And that brings us back again to the parable of the mustard seed. Just like that tiny seed has this potential to spread and grow, so does the gospel message. It has the power to transform individuals, communities, even entire nations.
And we as disciples are called to be sowers of that seed, right? To share the good news of God's love and grace with everyone we encounter.
Exactly. But I know for me, sharing my faith can feel intimidating. What if I say the wrong thing? What if people reject me? What if I don't have all the answers?
I struggle with those same fears sometimes. It's like, who am I to talk about these things? I'm just an ordinary person, not a theologian or a preacher.
But remember what we talked about earlier, it's not about our ability, it's about our availability. You know, God can use even the most ordinary, imperfect people to share his message.
No.
It's not about having all the answers, it's about pointing people to the one who does.
It's about being faithful conduits of God's love and truth.
Exactly. And, sometimes I think the most powerful witness comes from simply living out our faith authentically in our everyday lives.
It's about letting our actions speak louder than words. It's about
Mhm.
showing compassion, offering forgiveness, extending grace, just like Jesus did.
And sometimes it might involve having those difficult conversations, speaking up for what's right, challenging injustice.
It's about being those polished, set-apart vessels, ready to be used by God in whatever way he sees fit, even if it means stepping outside of our comfort zones or going against the flow.
This whole conversation has really challenged me to think about what it means to be a disciple in today's world. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life, to focus on our own little kingdoms, to lose sight of that bigger picture.
But this passage in Timothy reminds us that we're called to something greater.
Mhm.
We're called to be a part of God's grand narrative of redemption and restoration.
And that call, I think, requires us to make choices, to flee from those things that pull us away from God and to pursue those things that draw us closer to him.
It's about saying yes to God even when it's hard, even when it's costly, even when it doesn't make sense.
And when we make those choices, when we surrender to God's shaping, something amazing happens.
What's that?
We start to become more like the vessels that Paul describes, set apart, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. We become instruments of his grace, vessels of his love, beacons of his light in a dark world.
That's a powerful image to end on. It's a reminder that our lives have purpose, that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, and that even in our imperfections, God can use us to do extraordinary things.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this question. What kind of vessel are you? What is God shaping you to be? And what are those good works that he's preparing you for?
Those are great questions for all of us to ponder, and I hope this conversation has encouraged you to dive deeper into this passage in 2 Timothy and to discover for yourself what it means to be a vessel for honorable use in God's house.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.